so moving on to part 2 of I Am Malala, the Valley of Death. So the Taliban arrive is kind of my summary of what happens here, which is useful to kind of refresh where we're up to. Of course, we've got some maxims and quotes, which is another famous feature of her writing style. So, farewell music, even your sweetest tunes are best kept silent. The Taliban on the edge of the village have stilled all lips. So that's a pretty nice piece of foreshadowing as well. We're going to add that also, because things are not going to go well, as you might expect when a chapter is focusing on the Taliban arriving. So chapter 9, Radio Mullah, is kind of how the Taliban come in and try and destroy a lot of the Western culture and replace it with their own vision of the idea. So I'd been reading the Twilight books and longed to be vampires. That doesn't read very well as a sentence. I had been reading the Twilight books and longed to be vampires. Oh, right, okay, Maniba and I. Yeah, that makes sense. It seemed to us that the Taliban arrived in the night just like vampires. So, just like vampires is another rare simile. They were seized with strange-looking men with long, straggly hair and beards. So this, if you really wanted to, you could comment on this as a motif and how in part 1, beards are something the wise men have. And, I think maybe not her father, but perhaps her grandfather or sort of elders in her village are described as having white beards and sort of being very respectful, elderly, kind of learned figures. And so this is kind of, different kind of beard that we're talking about now, and just one that she finds abhorrent, essentially. So in the beginning, Fazlullah was very wise. He introduced himself as an Islamic reformer and an interpreter of the Quran. Sorry. So I've got here Fazlullah as teacher initially. So from the start he arrives and he sort of, that's kind of obviously initially is the foreshadowing, but of course she thinks that's kind of good. He said men should keep their beards. Yeah, cool. All sounding alright so far. Mullahs often misrepresent the Quran and Hadith when they teach in our country, as few people understand the original Arabic. So you can see how sort of religion is bound by reading and by education as well here. So it's sort of, I guess, hard in what she would think of as sort of, misinterpreting a religion if you can actually read it. And that's, for many of the failings of Catholicism or Christianity, they were very effective teachers of literacy, for what that's worth. So if you think of all the colonial places, if nothing else, the people learnt how to read English by reading the Bible. And I mean, that's obviously wasn't necessarily the goal of the people asking them to read the Bible, but obviously if you can't actually read the religious texts, then you're quite prone to be kind of overwhelmed by other people's ideas. 93, cases such as land disputes common in our area, which used to be resolved quickly, now took 10 years to come to court. Everyone wanted to see the back of the corrupt government officials. Corruption, orange, beautiful. So again, we're kind of an interesting contrast here, because the Pashtun culture that she described, at least, I can't actually speak on it myself, but the Pashtun culture that she spoke about was quite violent, and that justice was meted out quite liberally and quite instantly and quite violently. So basically the approach was eye for an eye. But what this is talking about is perhaps a more, what we would think of as a democratic concept, courts, but it took a long time, and that's something that she seems to think is not especially good, which is interesting. All music except for Taliban songs was declared haram. So haram is of course forbidden. Maybe make a note of that if that's not something you're familiar with. You must meet Maum Fazlullah. He's a great scholar. He's actually a high school dropout whose real name isn't Fazlullah. There you go. So straight away, she's always using education and level of education as a bit of a shorthand here for good people or bad people, as though education in and of itself makes good people out of bad, which is unfortunately not true, or education would be the best thing in the world, I guess. So 94, Mr. X has kept his beard and I congratulate him. So this is Fazlullah kind of on the radio, pumping people up. They saw Fazlullah as a kind of Robin Hood. Okay, so that's another intertextual reference. We've got here, after when they get power, they behave like the criminals they once hunted down. So that sounds like something her father would say. Fazlullah's broadcasts were often aimed at women. Of course they were, as is consistent with the rest of the story up until this point. So we very strongly get the idea she's not pleased with this Fazlullah person at all. Again, she's still sticking to the convention of peace be upon him, prophet, peace be upon him, anytime she speaks of the prophet, whilst, kind of on the same page, describing the way that Fazlullah is sort of doing a bad job with his interpretation of religion. So I also knew from watching my own mother that Pashtun women were very powerful and strong. So she's always constantly contrasting her own experience, sort of her own home life, her father and her mother, and her kind of what else she knows about the broader world. So think of this as home, world. And it might actually be a useful way for you to think of things. So you've sort of got her home life as kind of her grounding, and the outer world is something that she's increasingly becoming exposed to. But it's always home outwards, so she never says the world is like this and my home is different. It's always from the home out, which may be true for everyone, but perhaps especially true of young people like she was when she wrote this book. I agree that female teachers should educate girls, but first we need to educate our girls so they can become teachers. So this is the age-old problem. You need to really develop capacity in people so that they can develop capacity in other people, and that is a long and difficult process. And I've also got activism there. Okay, so that's that one there as well. Blend it together. If someone can show any example in history where Islam allows a female madrasa, they can come and piss on my beard. Well, there you go. That's a nice touch. Not really sure what I'm going to highlight that for, but we'll just put a beard in, and so you can see the significance in their culture of beards. My father, who only has a mustache, insisted he would not grow a beard for the Taliban. Oh, there you go. So that's one of his small forms of activism, and his kind of relatively well-known mustache, I guess, is something that he's clinging onto. All right, 98. Where you could wait years and years and have to pay bribes to be heard. So corruption, of course. So Pakistani courts are being bad-mouthed as well. To cure a disease before its onset is not in accord with Sharia law, said Fazlullah. You will not find a single child to drink a drop of the vaccine anywhere in SWAT. Yikes. Not ideal. So again, this one's sort of provided without too much commentary, but we at this point are very, very much along with sort of her worldview, so we know without really having to go into detail that she's against that, of course. So some of her kind of commentary slips away as we go along. So we're among those killed in an American drone attack. So again, you can really see from my bad drawing of a drone, the kind of drone activity is increasing. Then we've got our bad drawing of suicide bombers. And quite often these two things are sort of contrasted, like one leads to the other. So sort of being inhumane and using a drone attack will kind of lead to the suicide bombing, which is kind of in one way an innovative technical response, and very low tech and very cheap in comparison. So on this Eid, two-legged animals will be sacrificed. Whew. Okay, so if you're not familiar, Eid is basically like analogous to Christmas for a Muslim person, and so to say that on this Eid two-legged animals will be sacrificed is kind of a mirror of in Eid normally you sacrifice an animal like a goat or a sheep, and in this one they're doing two-legged animals, so it's pretty gross. but that at least is some context so you know what that's all about. I'm going to jump to 101 because there's lots of space to write on ultimately. You have put the first stone in standing water, they said, now we will have the courage to speak. So that's kind of dun dun dun. He's sort of, him speaking out is kind of putting a rock in the standing water so they can step across, I guess. So sister, you are bringing shame, you must wear burqas. So gender roles, of course. So there you go, they're bringing shame upon them by wearing that. We've got some Western East culture stuff happening here. So there's Western and infidel, so they think because he's teaching that he must be teaching Western stuff, though perhaps he may well be, depending on who you ask probably, but I mean compared to the traditional teaching in that place, I wouldn't be surprised if his was viewed as Western in all honesty. So that's chapter 9.